Good evening. Sit down, Bill. Welcome to All Saints and Happy Pride. We are very excited to get this series underway. I can tell you that I'm Jeff. This is Jen. We are co-chairs of the LGBTQ+ task force here at All Saints. And Jen brought this to our attention, and I'm like, yeah, okay, sure. But I read it, and wow, did I read it. It is very eye-opening and very, very well written and very well researched information. So before we get started, for those of you who are not familiar with our church, if you need to use the restroom, they're right out the door and to your right when you're facing that way. Do you want me to? Obviously, the doors you came in are your exits, and you have another emergency exit over here should something happen, which we don't expect. I've already lost my train of thought now.
I'm so sorry. That's why you have a co-chair.
This evening, the program is several short videos, so you'll have an opportunity to have some time if you wanted to jot down some questions, because after the presentation is over, we would like to have a discussion group. Looks like right now we won't all fit up here, so we may have to do that from the pews, but we'll play that by ear at the end. But as I say, you'll have plenty of time to write down questions and go from there. What's that? Oh, you should all have a handout. Again, I'm going to show you the book because I learned some really great news tonight that anyone interested in purchasing the book, it will be made available through All Saints. We have a sign-up sheet out in the lobby in the entranceway. And if you forget to sign up for that, you can always call the parish. Not quite sure what the cost of the book is, but I'm under the impression if you can't quite handle all of it, that the church will help you out. Am I missing anything? I don't think so. With that, I'm going to ask Father Fred to come up and get us started. And again, thank you all for being here. This is fantastic.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to have everyone here, and let us give a hello to those who are joining us remotely, and we know we have a good number of people that are joining us this evening, so great to have everybody together. And I just wanted to make a couple of points before we get going. As we know, those who've heard our promotion of this, that Colby Martin is from the Evangelical Church, and his theology and studies were primarily in that direction. But the theology concerning the 6 clobber passages that he has studied and are in the book and will be in our process this month is right on line, 100% with all mainline Catholic and mainline Christian biblical scholars. So his research has gone much wider than just his evangelical arm. So that's really important that for us, I think, to realize that this isn't just some ideas that he has, but this is what, if you took a course in the Hebrew Scriptures or the New Testament at Lemoyne College or Harvard or Notre Dame University, the scholars would be saying exactly what we're hearing in this series. So that's really important. Not only mainline Catholic theologians, but it's very interesting that recent biblical studies in the last 60 to 70 years would be the backdrop for the conclusions made in this book. And so even the official church has taught us that we have to go beyond what's called proof texting. And proof texting is taking a line in the scriptures out of context and using it to make a point. If you took the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures and you start proof texting, you could prove anything. You could back up anything. Racism, sexism, homophobia, you name it, slavery, racism, it's, and so we need to look at the scriptures in their context. And also a wonderful thing that's happening in contemporary studies of scripture with our renewed understanding of the ancient languages and anthropology and the like, we're beginning to understand what's being said in the context of that time. And I always use this example. I'm sure some of you have heard me say this before. But for example, if 300 years from now, archaeologists were digging and they discovered the Syracuse Post Standard, but they didn't know, most people never, didn't know, only scholars knew the English language. So the scholars, start reading the Post Standard and they read a line that says, "It was raining cats and dogs downtown yesterday." Well, if you took that literally, you'd say it was raining cats and dogs were coming out of the air. Well, that's exactly the trouble we get into in our scriptures when we take them literally and when we use proof texting to try to prove our point. So I just wanted to give that little background and to ensure us who are coming from a Catholic perspective that this is in line with our contemporary studies. I'd like to just, for a little opening prayer, just read the last paragraph of his book that I think sets the tone for what we're about here this month. For the Christian who has been wounded by the church and by Christians, I pray you see those who hurt you as Christ saw the Roman soldiers and say, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." For the Christian who remains convinced that homosexuality is not God's design and that same-sex relationships are not okay, I pray you see the LGBTQ community not as people to fix or sinners to shun, but as brothers and sisters to love, listen to, and seek to understand. For those struggling to know what they believe in all this, or wondering how or if to follow the small voice in their hearts, that might be calling them to frightening new places. I pray you let go of the need for certainty and learn and lean into the trust that God is the author and the perfecter of your faith. No matter who you are or what journey you are on, know this: you are loved and fully accepted. You are a loved and fully accepted child of God. May you walk all your days grounded in that identity, which is the truest thing about you. And may you have eyes to see that everyone around you is also loved and fully accepted as a child of God. Peace be with you. Amen. So let's get started.
I'm going to bring up a brief video for those of you who maybe are not familiar with Colby Martin, just so you can see who he is. It's only about 2 minutes long, and then we'll go right into our first chapter. Tonight we're going to be looking at the scriptures from Genesis, and then the remaining series we go through Leviticus, Romans, Corinthians, and Timothy. So those are the clobber passages we'll be covering. Let me see how good I am with this, because this is not usually my job. So here we go. This is just a quick overview of who Colby Martin is.
In 2011, the evangelical megachurch that I was a pastor at fired me when I told them that my theology had shifted and that I no longer believed that being gay was a sin. According to them, and this is true for most evangelical Christians still today, the Bible is clear. Homosexuality is wrong, and God is against those who identify as LGBTQ. Well, I think they're wrong, and I think Christians have been misusing the Bible in this way for far too long. Hi, I'm Colby, and I'm the author of this book, Unclobber: Rethinking Our Misuse of the Bible on Homosexuality. Now, half of the book tells the story of my journey moving from a born and raised conservative Baptist who went on to become an evangelical pastor, who then started studying his Bible and asking questions that he never really asked before, leading him, well, okay, I'm not sure why I started going third person there, leading me to conclude that those who identify as lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual, queer, or LGBTQ for short, are beautiful, wonderful, beloved children of God, just as much as anyone else. And we call this position open and affirming. And as I mentioned a moment ago, such a position does not sit well with most evangelical conservative Christians or churches. And then the other half of the book is the result of my time spent studying the clobber passages, which are the 6 or so verses in the entire Bible that have historically been used to justify discrimination against those who identify LGBTQ. And in these chapters, I demonstrate how the traditional interpretation and the traditional application of these passages have really missed the mark in some profound ways with disastrous results. All right. Introduction to Genesis, take one. All right, welcome to Unclobbering Genesis, caring for the outsider. Hopefully at this point you've watched the introduction video and so you know a little bit more about me and about why I do this work. But this is the course for Genesis 19. And when I teach the workshops or when I teach all of the clobber passages, maybe in one time, I like to go in chronological order. So I will start with Genesis 19, really because it's just the first one that shows up in the Bible. But also I start here because maybe 2 reasons. One, because it might be the most famous story when people think about things like homosexuality in the Bible, you know, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the idea that God would destroy entire cities because of sodomy. I mean, this word sodomy came from this story of the city of Sodom and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and raining, fire from heaven. So, people know the story, but I like to start here because in some ways it's the easiest of the clobber passages to sort of hold under a microscope and explore and come out on the other side with, oh yeah, this doesn't say what we've always thought it said. And in fact, a lot of conservative, what I would call conservative, non-affirming theologians have kind of stopped using this passage altogether in their defense of the traditional teaching on sexuality in the Bible, because I think they themselves have sort of gotten to the bottom of the pot and realized that there's nothing here. There's no there. And so, so we're going to do that here in this course, which will be divided into 6 sessions. And we're going to start with the session 1. It's going to be about the broader context of the ancient world. Session 2 is going to talk about the context within the book of Genesis itself. Then in session 3, we'll dive into the actual story found in Genesis 19 of the destruction. By the way, hopefully you have the worksheets that you're following along with that have all the blanks that you can fill in, so you can get that here in the course section where there's downloadable content. Then in session 4, we'll talk about 5 key observations that I have about this story here in Genesis 19. Session 5, we're going to talk about the larger biblical witness. So what does the rest of the Bible have to say about why Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed? And then finally, the last session, which is how all my Unclobber courses are structured. The final session is just simply titled Unclobbering Genesis 19. So that's the plan. Why don't you go ahead and click that you finished this video, and we'll head on to the next one. Time to dig into Genesis 19. Let's unclobber this thing, shall we? So this first session here, I'm titling The Broader Context of the Ancient World. And here's where we'll start. It's going to be important for all of these passages that we worked on Clobber. It's going to be important that we do the necessary work to try, and it is trying. We obviously can't do it with exact precision, but try to put ourselves into the context in which these stories or letters or words were created. We can't just come to, especially the English translation, we can't just come to a Bible off of our shelf and read it in English in the 21st century and be like, oh, well, that's pretty clear, so moving on. No, it doesn't work that way. The cultures in which these were written were vastly different, and we need to take that into account. That matters. It matters how these things were originally intended. So, in the ancient world, there was a high premium placed on the value of hospitality. So that's the first blank there. Hopefully, again, you've got your worksheets at home that you can be following along with. But there was an extremely high value placed on hospitality in the ancient world. And that's a little maybe confusing to us modern folk, where when we think of hospitality, we might just think of, like, I don't know, making sure that when you have guests over that you take their coat when they come through the door, or that you have a nice music playing in the background, or that you've got food and drinks set out. Like, we might think of that sort of hospitality, clean sheets for people who are staying in your house, that sort of thing. But in the ancient world, hospitality was way deeper than that. So much so that the Greeks actually had a word, xenia, which was a way of talking about friendship of the other, friendship of the outsider. That's where we get our word xenophobia, which is like this fear of the outside. So in the ancient world, if you wanted to talk about cultures or people that, you'd hold them up as like, these are really good people, you would talk about how hospitable they were to outsiders, to guests, to others. And then conversely, if you wanted to point out how bad people were, you would talk about how they treated outsiders. When I wrote this chapter in the book, I tell the following story. And it goes like this. Two foreigners, this is an ancient story, this is a story that comes to us from the ancient world. Two foreigners arrive late one night to a town whose reputation for wickedness is well known. The foreigners receive shelter and provisions at just one home in particular, highlighting the stark contrast between the host of that one home and the rest of the wicked town. The two foreigners reveal to their hospitable host that they have actually come that night on a divine mission to destroy the town. Turns out these were divine guests clothed as humans. However, due to the generous hospitality shown to them by this one home, the two foreigners want to save their hosts, and they urge them to leave town immediately and don't look back as you go. Finally, when the escaping family crosses the borders of the town, they glance behind them and they witness the utter destruction of the entire city and all the wicked occupants therein. And then I ask the reader, do you recognize that story? And you might think, obviously we would think, that's the story of Genesis 19, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But no, actually, as it turns out, that's the story of Baucis and Philemon, as told by the Roman poet Ovid in his masterpiece, Metamorphoses. Almost identical plot points and characters and overall thrust of the story. Late night, divine guests disguised as humans show up to destroy a wicked town, but one hospitable host sort of is saved. And the reason why I point that out is because stories like this, stories like Sodom and Gomorrah and Baucis and Philemon, were relatively common in the ancient world as a way to, again, talk about the high value placed on hospitality. These stories highlighted what it looked like to be people who cared for the outsiders and therefore were viewed as moral, upright, righteous people. And the inverse is, if you don't care for the outsider, if you don't show hospitality to visitors, you're wicked and cruel, and the gods will destroy you. Now, also in the ancient world, it's worth pointing out that if you wanted to do a display of power, you wanted to flex your power over your enemy, the way you would do that would be to dominate them and humiliate them. It wasn't just enough to just conquer them. It had to be even more, to dominate and humiliate. And this will come up in the story as the men of Sodom don't just want to show the late night visitors like who's boss. They want to dominate and humiliate these men as a way to sort of show their power. Again, this is the wickedness of those who are inhospitable to the outsiders. This was the ancient world. So this is a bit of the broader context of the ancient world, and I think it's important that this is where we start before we dive into the actual story.
So that's our first segment, the broader context of the ancient world. If you want to take just a few minutes, or we'll even just take less than a minute, jot down any questions you might have, any insights maybe that gave you, or any comments that you think based on what you heard that you might want to bring up in the discussion that you may not remember half an hour from now. And then we'll go on to the next section. Skipped us all the way ahead. Session. There we go. You definitely had time to write down ideas.
All right, now that we've covered the broader context of the ancient world, let's look here now in session 2 at the broader context now specifically within the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is in chapter 19 of the book of Genesis. And here's where I like to start really with almost any sort of exploration of any text in the Bible, but this is especially true, I think, of Old Testament stories. And it's this. Is one of the questions that I think is really, really important to ask when trying to read and understand and, good Lord, interpret these stories, these texts that are thousands of years old. One of the things that I think is worth asking, and these are the first blanks here, is whether or not you take this story as literally happening or as a metaphor or sort of a mythological story. The question that we still must ask is why was this story preserved? Why did the Israelites preserve this story? And here's what I mean. There are those, and you might be one of them, and no judgment, it's just there are those, and this is certainly true for me in my conservative evangelical days. There are those for whom stories like this in the Old Testament, like Sodom and Gomorrah, the assumption is that when we read them, we should read them literally, as though these are historical accounts of things that actually happened. That if we can have a fly-on-the-wall perspective, then there actually was late-night visitors into the city of Sodom, met by a guy named Lot, who kept them safe from the rest of the men of Sodom, and then these angelic beings destroyed these cities. And that is an actual thing that happened. I'm less inclined anymore to really go that route. And part of that, like we mentioned in the previous session, was that there's just a lot of ancient stories that have these same themes. So And that's just one reason why. But I think in general, these, especially the stories in Genesis, they weren't intended to be literal historical accounts of what actually happened. Rather, these were stories that were told and retold and preserved and edited by this emerging people group, the Israelites, who had been, after having been liberated from Pharaoh and the Egyptians, began to become their own people group and then tell the story of where they came from. And this story is one of many stories as a way to sort of highlight who they were, who their God Yahweh was in contrast to all the other many gods of the ancient world. And so my point here is whether you take it literally, you think that this actually happened, or sort of metaphorically, or maybe some other way, I still think we need to ask, why did the Israelites preserve this story? Why this and other stories did this get included? And so I think, when I ask that question, I think it goes back to what we said in the previous session about the way that talking about hospitality in the ancient world was like a shorthand for talking about whether or not people were righteous and upright, and whether entire people groups were good or bad. And so this was like ancient Israelites, this was their flagship story of contrasting what it looks like to be hospitable or not. And you see this because if you back up one chapter from Genesis 19, if you go to the 18th chapter, there's a story there where God and some of God's buddies, a couple angels, visit Abraham and Sarah. And in that story, what you see this beautiful demonstration of hospitality. And so that's the other blank there. It's at chapters 18 and 19. You see this contrast in hospitality between Abraham in chapter 18 and then Lot in 19 versus Sodom and Gomorrah in chapter 19. In chapter 18, you have, we'll talk about this in a future session, you have Abraham and Sarah showing great deference to their visitors and providing for their visitors and really showing this ancient value of hospitality. And that's who Israel wants to be. That's the people that they want to be in the world. And then the contrast is the very next story. If we don't do this, if we don't hold on to these values, if we don't embody this sort of hospitality, we're going to end up like Sodom and Gomorrah. And so these stories were like these constant reminders of who they wanted to be in the world, who they were called to be in the world, and what would happen if they neglected that calling. What would happen if they didn't care for the outsider, if they didn't use their resources to provide for the needs of those who were suffering in the world. And so for me, when I look at the broader context of Genesis 19 and maybe why the story was even in it, for me, this is about understanding that this story was preserved and passed on because Israel, the tribe of Israel, wanted to embody and be a light for who Yahweh was. And Yahweh was what? A God who cared for the outsider, a God who heard the cries of the oppressed, which shows up here in the story in chapter 19. And so leading into Genesis 19 and the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the way that chapter 18 ends, again, Abraham and Sarah show this great hospitality to the Lord. They provide them with welcome, and they provide food and shelter for them. Then the storyteller says in Genesis 18 that the Lord looked out upon Sodom and said, the cries of injustice from Sodom and Gomorrah are countless, and their sin is very serious. So the Lord says, I will go down now to examine these cries of injustice that have reached me. Have they really done all this? If not, I want to know. This is chapter 18, verse 20 and 21. And that begins this really fascinating back and forth conversation between Abraham and the Lord, where Abraham's like, okay, but so what if there's like 50 good people in Sodom? Like, surely you wouldn't destroy an entire city over that, right? Like, you wouldn't destroy all the innocent. God's like, all right, if you can find 50, I won't destroy. Abraham's like, what about 40? What if we can find 40? Will you preserve the city for 40? All right, we can do 40. What about 30? Abraham pushes a little farther. Yeah, okay. If you can find 30, Abraham keeps going. What about 20? I don't know if the Lord actually sighed or grunted, but that's what I did. Fine, yes. And then at the end, Abraham's like, how about 10? If we can find just 10 like, decent, morally upright people, can you maybe like not destroy the whole city? Which I think is this really cool story of a couple things. One is humans' capacity to like talk with God, and maybe God isn't this immovable force that can't be reasoned with. Is one way to sort of think about how maybe the ancient Jewish people thought about God. But then also just, it shows this commitment from Abraham and the ancient Israelites, this commitment to how do I want to say this? To preserve the innocent and to have this sort of heightened, elevated sense of caring for those who are in need. Abraham, I mean, this is deep compassion. Like, if we can find just a handful of people, can we maybe not destroy everyone? Even though maybe, God, I agree with you, yeah, they deserve it, but maybe not. And so I love that story. I love that sort of lead up into Genesis 19, where you get this stark contrast between what hospitality ought to look like and what inhospitality looks like in Genesis 19. So that's what we're going to get to now in the next session.
Okay, once again, you got a little time. If you got some thoughts, questions you might save for a little bit later, feel free to write them down before we proceed.
At long last, let's actually get to the text after we've established sort of the context of the ancient world and the context of this story in Genesis. Now, I'm going to go through in this session and read through the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and make a few observations along the way, but mostly we'll save the main observations for session 4. So let's jump into the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, at the end of this chapter, it refers to Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed. However, the story really just takes place in Sodom, but doesn't matter. Just imagine that these are sort of the same cities, if you will. They all get the same penalty, which is absolute annihilation. And just to remind you where we just came from at the end of chapter 18 on Genesis was this conversation between the Lord and Abraham, which is where the Lord said, I'm going to destroy Sodom because the cries of injustices have reached my ear, basically making God deaf with how loud they are because the wickedness is so intense in Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham says, okay, but if you can find if there's just 10 people who are worthy, then will you not destroy the whole place? And so God acquiesced and sent then 2 of his angels, if you will, down to investigate and to search, see if they can find anyone worth preserving the entire city. And so that's here now, verse 1 of chapter 19. And it goes like this. The 2 messengers entered Sodom in the evening. Lot, and Lot is the nephew of Abraham, who traveled with Abraham when God told Abram to leave his family and go to basically the promised land. And then Abram and Lot got into a bit of a quarrel, and so they split, and Abram went this way to settle, and Lot went that way and sort of joined with the people of Sodom. And Lot was sitting at the gate of Sodom that night, and he saw the 2 messengers come up, and so he got up, and he greeted them, and he bowed low, showed deference and humility to them, which we'll talk about in the next session, how that embodies this ancient value of hospitality. Verse 2, Lot said, come to your servant's house, spend the night, wash your feet, and then you can get up early and go on your way. And this is Lot sort of, again, showing this contrast of good hospitality versus what Sodom was known for, and what ultimately the point of the story is illustrating here. Come to your servant's house. I'll take care of you. Stay with me. I'll wash your feet, which was this beautiful, humble act of service and love. And then get up early in the morning, and I'll make you waffles like Donkey and Shrek, and then you can go on your way. But the two men said, no, it's all good. We'll spend the night here in the town square. And then verse 3, Lot pleaded earnestly with them. No, seriously, guys. Listen to me. You do not want to do that. See, Lot had been here at Sodom for long enough now. He's probably seen this played out multiple times. He knows how this story ends. And it doesn't end well. Like we talked about in the first session, how in the ancient world, if you wanted to show your authority, your power over your enemies or outsiders, you would seek to dominate them and humiliate them. And Lot just knew that the people of Sodom were not good to outsiders. They did not take care of people well. And something deep in him knew that, okay, these two men, I just can't let this happen to them. So come stay at my house. Please don't stay out in the square. Just trust me on this. So he pleaded earnestly with them. And they relented until they went with him and entered his house. And he made a big meal for them, even making unleavened bread. Whew, that was nice of you, Lot. And they ate. Verse 4, but before everybody went to bed, all the men of the city, all of them, everyone from the youngest to the oldest, came and surrounded Lot's house. Word got out. These visitors have arrived late in the city, and Sodom was coming to do what Sodom did. And they called out to Lot, where are the men who arrived tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may have sex with them. I think the King James Version would say this, so that we may know them, which is just a euphemism for have sex with them. This is exactly what Lot knew would happen, which is why he didn't want the men to stay out in the city square. Bring them to us so that we can have our way with them. In verse 6, Lot went out toward the entrance and closed the door behind him and said, guys, bros, brothers, come on. Don't do this thing. Please, don't do this evil thing. This thing that I just know you so often do. Can we just not? Can we take a night off? These are my visitors. These are my guests. And then in verse 8, he says this horrible thing, by the way. We need to give ourselves all the freedom and permission in the world when reading anything in the Bible to be like, yeah, that's gross. Yeah, that's awful. Yeah, that's wrong. And this is one of those. But we'll talk a little bit more about it in the next session. Verse 8, I've got 2 daughters, Lot says, who are virgins. Here. You can have them. Do with them what you wish. Just don't do anything to these men because they're now under the protection of my roof. Like I said, horrible. And I'll talk more about that in the next session. Verse 9, they said, get out of the way. And they continued, does this immigrant want to judge us? This Lot being the immigrant, this outsider? He's not one of us. He's going to try to judge us? Get out of the way. We're going to hurt you more than we hurt them. So they pushed Lot back, and they came close to breaking down the door. And then the 2 angelic beings reached out and pulled Lot back into the house and slammed the door. Verse 11, then they blinded all the men at the entrance to the house, from the youngest to the oldest, so that the men were just groping around trying to find the entrance. And the men said to Lot, who all is with you here? Take away from this place. Take your son-in-laws and your sons and your daughters and everyone else that you have in the city, because we're going to destroy this place. We came here to see if we could find just 10 people to honor the agreement that God made with Abraham, and clearly the cries of injustice that have reached the ears of God are founded in reality. This place has got to go. We're about to destroy this place, verse 13. The Lord has found the cries of injustice so serious, that the Lord sent us to destroy it. Let's skip ahead to verse 23. So as the sun rose over the earth, Lot arrived in Zoar, and the Lord rained down burning asphalt from the skies onto Sodom and Gomorrah. The Lord destroyed these cities, the entire valley, everyone who lived in the cities and all the fertile land's vegetation. And this, my friends, is the story that had been told and retold throughout ancient Israelites' history to serve as this constant reminder, this example of the consequence, as we'll see here in future sessions, the consequence of not taking care of the outsider, of not showing hospitality to those who are unlike you. This is what this is the point of the story. We'll get more of that in a minute. But the story ends there, and tragically, it has then been used in much of Christianity to be held up as this proof. See, this is what God does to homosexuals. Destroys an entire city. Because we're about to find out that is not why Sodom was destroyed.
Your next pause. I think it is important that those sitting here, and many of you parishioners in this place, understand what it means when we say all are welcome. This is an amazing place we have here.
Okay, session 4, which I am calling 5 key observations from this story. We've got a lot of blanks to fill out here, so good folding. A lot of blanks to fill out on this one, so hopefully you've got that with you, either print it out and using a pen, or maybe like a PDF, and I don't know how that would work with a PDF, but you're probably smarter than I am, you can figure it out. But now we're gonna dive into the story that we just went through in the previous session, the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah from Genesis 19. And I'm going to pull out 5 key observations from this story that I think are worth really seriously considering when it comes to looking at this passage. I mean, like, is this really justifying discrimination against those who identify LGBTQ? Spoiler alert, no, it's not. All right, here we go. First one is this. First thing I want to point out is Lot's sort of the fourfold pattern of hospitality that Lot models for in the ancient world. And this is, again, why I think this story is part of the canon of the Old Testament. Why Israel told this story over and over and over again and eventually wrote it down and solidified it is because this is the type of people that they believed that Yahweh was calling them to be, a hospitable people who modeled what the Greeks called xenia, guest friendship. And here is what Lot did for his late night guests, is he honored them. He honored them. He said, my lords, like bowed down to them. He greeted them and showed them deference and respect. How often do we do that in our day-to-day life? How often do we come across somebody who's very different from us, very unlike us, very much an outsider, someone who's other? Do we immediately grant them dignity and respect and honor? Well, this is what Lot does in the story. Honors them, my lords, my lords. Then he gives them welcome. He says, come to your servant's house. Come and stay with me. Like, you are welcome here. You are welcome here. And I'll put a little asterisk there for how that phrase, I'll probably talk about this in maybe a different course, a different session, but that phrase, you are welcome here, just how freaking annoying and triggering that can be right now for many LGBTQ people and even allies, but obviously mostly for queer folk, for churches that say, you're welcome here. We welcome all people. But then once you get in, you discover that the closer you get to the Holy of Holies, you realize, oh no, we don't really belong here. We can't serve. We can't be in leadership. We can't keep being gay. Yeah, you're welcome here as long as you eventually become straight or stop whatever it is you're doing. Anyway, Different topic for a different point. But the idea is that Lot honors them, he welcomes them, please come and stay. This is hospitality, like mi casa es su casa. You are welcome here. And then P, provision. He provides for them. Spend the night with me. Enjoy my linen sheets. Sleep on my Casper mattress. He says, spend the night with me. I'll wash your feet. And like I mentioned in the last session, this is like a beautiful, symbolic, and yet very tangible gesture in the ancient world to show like humility and love and care. I mean, these dirty feet, because, if they even had sandals, they were exposed and their feet were just always dirty. But so then the act of washing them was just this, again, this sign of you matter. You're worthy. And then finally, I got there, E, he empowered him, which is to say, when Lot said, get up early and go on your way. I'll provide for you, and then I will help you go on your way. This, to me, is like this fourfold pattern of hospitality in the ancient world that I see as why this part of why this story exists in the book of Genesis. Get up early and go on your way, and empowered them. Okay, so that's my first observation. Observation number 2. The men of the city. And I kind of pointed this out as I was reading the story in the previous session. But the storyteller multiple times wants us to hear that all the men of the city, young and old, all the men came to the door. Like all of them. This was evidently a very important detail for the storyteller. So if nothing else, can we please then acknowledge that this is not a story about sexual orientation? Because not all the men in the city can be gay, will be gay, are gay. Like this is not about orientation. This is not about the men of Sodom being gay. We have decent statistics that sort of show, and even at the highest range of how many people might have a same-sex attraction, sexual orientation, it doesn't get into the double digits really. And if so, it's really low. Like, it's just, there's no way 100%, all the men, that's my point here. The storyteller says all the men came to the door. And these are not, the point here is that these were not gay men. This is not a story about sexual orientation. It's not a story about homosexuality as an orientation, okay? Number 3, the mob wanted to know the visitors. But this is what the men of Sodom wanted. They wanted to, like we read in the story in the last session, they wanted to have sex with the men. But here's the thing. This was not like mutual, this was not making love. This was not about sex between two people of the same sex who are both mutually consenting and respecting. Really here, this is about gang rape. And this goes back to, in the ancient world, showing that domination and that humiliation over your enemies or over the outsiders to demonstrate that you are the one in control and in power here. This is what's going on in this story. The men of Sodom didn't want to discover, what the two visitors, what their favorite color was, what they like to eat. Tell us about your childhood. What are some of your favorite hobbies? They didn't want to get to know them and eventually then have a relationship with them. No. They wanted to dominate them. They wanted to humiliate them. This is the sort of wickedness, the injustice that reached the ears of the divine. The point here is not that this is a relationship between equals. All right? Like we get that, right? We get that it was all the men in the city, so they're not gay men. They're not men who identify as homosexual in the classic, or in the clinical sense. And 2, this isn't about a relationship between equals. This is just not what the story's about. Okay? Observation number 4, and I alluded to this again in the last session. Call it Lot's obscene offer. I mean, probably could have used a lot stronger language than that, right? clearly this is an inhumane offer from Lot, where he says, no, here's 2 of my virgin daughters, do what you want with them. Now, I think part of it, what's at play here is look, we need to name that this was a totally different culture. This was ancient Near East culture of 2, 3, 4,000 years ago. And so, yeah, our ancient ancestors had a far different philosophy of children, and then women too. Like, women were property, daughters were property. And it wasn't seen as the worst thing in the world to offer your property to others. That was, anyways, how the whole thing worked. So yeah, today, back then, still, it's gross and it's wrong, and it's gross and it's wrong. Like, there's no, that's obvious. It wasn't okay back then and wrong now. It's always wrong. But we can at least, in our minds, be able to differentiate between the different cultures. But what I also want to point out is that I think maybe, if nothing else, this is like a storytelling device. This is a detail that was inserted into the story, or just whatever, added to the drama, to really fully illustrate just how grave the failure is to fail to show hospitality. So it's like, how can we really, really drive home the point that being inhospitable to guests is a grievous, grievous sin? Well, what if we took something that was really, really egregious and said that it's worse than that? So maybe it's just this storytelling device being like, yeah, as bad as it would be to offer your 2 virgin daughters, even worse than that is the failure to show hospitality, which again, to our modern ears, is completely asinine in many ways, in all ways. But I think this is maybe what might be going on in this part of the story, if that makes sense. Okay, and then the 5th observation here that I have from the story that we just read is, this is not a story dealing with orientation. We've made that point. And it's not a story about loving and consensual relationships. So really this observation is just a summary of the previous 4 observations. But the point here is that after reading the story and exploring it and understanding it a bit in the context of the culture and the context of the book of Genesis, y'all, this is not a story about sexual orientation. This is not a story about homosexuality. This is not a story that deals with loving consensual relationships between 2 people of the same sex. Not only is it not about that, but it then it couldn't be used to say that those things are wrong. So how can this story speak to a person's sexual orientation? It can't. It doesn't. It doesn't. No one should be clobbered. No LGBTQ person should be clobbered by this story. This is not a story about loving. This is not like the ancient Jews' story to be like, and so therefore we are against all relationships between 2 people of the same sex, even if they're mutual and loving and respectful. No, this is not what this story is about. And we'll sort of then sum all that up here in session 6. But before we get to session 6, now I want to, in the next session, let's look at now the what I call the larger biblical witness. Because I think just stopping here and saying, well, we've done our own sort of survey of Genesis 19 and we've read the story and we've sort of paid attention to what's going on, and yeah, this is not a story about these things. There's enough, it's sufficient right there. But we can even go a step further, because there are quite a few instances in the rest of the Bible of people that are looking back at the history of Sodom and Gomorrah and telling us what their sins were, telling us why they were destroyed. And spoiler alert, it's nothing to do with homosexuality.
Little break here. One word. That was pretty heavy. And I have to apologize for my phone going off. My 87-year-old Nat needed something.
Session number 5, what I'm calling the larger biblical witness. In this session, we're going to listen as other prophets and other figures later on after the events of the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah reflect back upon that. And again, this is helping us understand what this story accomplished in the history of the people of Israel, why it was a part of their canon, why it was a part of their one of the stories of their ancient ancestors that they told. And just to reiterate, again, it's not that this was a historical event that they were saying actually happened, as much as it was like one of the defining myths, one of the defining stories that were meant to illustrate and characterize how the Israelites were to embody the character of Yahweh. Okay, so here's what the rest of the Bible has to say about Sodom and Gomorrah. First, we start with Isaiah chapter 1. When Isaiah is prophesying, in his day, Israel had completely lost their way. Completely sort of lost the plot of the point. And if one of the plot points, one of the purposes of Israel was to be a hospitable people, then by Isaiah's day, that, along with many other things, had completely been neglected and forgotten. They were caught up, Isaiah talked about, in this heartless religion. They neglected their calling as being children of God. And so God rants against the people of Israel, and he refers to them as like leaders of Sodom and Gomorrah. Like, yeah, you're basically just like Sodom and Gomorrah is what God is saying to Israel through Isaiah. And so Isaiah chapter 1, you find this condemnation for the people of Israel for their failure to do good, to seek justice, and to defend the oppressed. And you see that there in verse 9, that if the Lord of heavenly forces had not spared a few of us, Isaiah speaking about Israel, then we would be like Sodom and we'd resemble Gomorrah. So you have this connection between the people of Israel and the ancient cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And what was the comparison? What was Isaiah saying they shared in common? Was that they failed to do good. They failed to seek justice. They failed to defend the oppressed. Notice what's missing? Yeah, anything having to do with like sex or homosexuality. This was not how Isaiah and the people of Israel talked about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Then we go to Jeremiah. And in Jeremiah's day, again, we have prophets neglecting their duty. Prophets is like, I'm reminded of Ocean's 11, the character played by Don Cheadle in the opening scene. He's like, "You tosses, you had one job to do." This is what I think of when I think of Jeremiah as a prophet. He's like, seriously, prophets, you have one job to do. And so Jeremiah is a prophet against the prophets, and he calls out the prophets, calls them, because the prophets were not calling people to repent, and even worse, they were adulterers and liars themselves. So they were like, not only were they not doing their job, they were doing the things they were supposed to be prophesying against. You have that verse 14. "And the prophets of Jerusalem," Jeremiah wrote, "I saw something horrible. They commit adultery and tell lies. They encourage evildoers so that no one turns from their wickedness. Like, you're supposed to be speaking out against evildoers, not encouraging them. Prophet fail. And then he says, in my eyes, they are no better than Sodom. Its people are like Gomorrah. Not because they had sex with people of the same sex. No. It's because of their wickedness, because of just sort of their general refusal to care for people. So anyway, again, you have another prophet calling back to ancient story of Sodom and Gomorrah with no reference to sexual sin or sexual orientation or any of that. Hope you're picking up a pattern here. So then we go to Ezekiel, another prophet. And Ezekiel, in chapter 16, the people of Sodom, he described as uncaring. So this is like the most clear description of what the sins of Sodom were. That the Sodom people were described as uncaring, and the fact that they had resources, but they didn't use them. They didn't use their resources to help those who needed it. Check this out from Ezekiel 16, verse 49. This is the sin of your sister Sodom. Ready? It's not homosexuality. This is the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were proud, had plenty to eat, and enjoyed peace and prosperity. But she didn't help the poor and the needy. Right there, if you are watching this and you live like I do in the country of America, how convicting ought that be? Ezekiel is just speaking right to us. We have plenty to eat. Plenty to eat. So much prosperity. But what are we doing to help the poor and needy? This was Ezekiel's raging against the people of Israel. He talks about, this is just like Sodom. Verse 50, they became haughty. I feel like that's not a word we use enough these days. And they did detestable things in front of me, and I turned away from them as soon as I saw it. What was the sin of Sodom? They didn't care about helping people. Nope. Instead, they would storm the gates of visitors and dominate them and humiliate them and do anything other than be hospitable to them. Okay? And then the last biblical witness that I want to point to comes from the New Testament. And this is where the context here is that in Matthew 10, Jesus is sending out his 12 disciples to go from village to village to announce the arrival of the kingdom of God. So this was a pretty big deal. Jesus sending his friends out to go spread the good news. And he says to them, if people are like Lot, well, that's my interpretation. Sorry, Jesus didn't say this, but my paraphrase is like, you remember how Lot would welcome people and honor them and provide for them? If people do that, then say peace to their house. Bless them. Jesus says, but if they don't do that, if they reject you, if they don't care for you, if they don't welcome you, if they don't provide for your needs, Jesus says, then get out of there. Shake the dust off your feet. Walk away. Just leave. In a sense, if the cities refuse hospitality to you, my friends, Jesus is like, well, pretty much they're just like Sodom and Gomorrah. Verse 14 there, if anyone refuses to welcome you or to listen to your words, shake the dust off your feet as you leave that house or city. I assure you it will be more bearable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on Judgment Day than it will be for that city. Right here we have Jesus referring to Sodom and Gomorrah. And what is the context? It's not about sexuality. It's not about sex at all. It's about this failure to show hospitality. This failure to, as I talked about in the last session with Lot, as Lot embodied the failure to welcome people, to honor them, to provide for them, to empower them. A failure to do that, a failure to show that sort of hospitality was a serious issue for the people of Israel. And Jesus said, if you are out there and people are failing to show you hospitality, man, they're just like Sodom and Gomorrah. And again, I just want to point out, none of this has anything to do with sex and sexuality. Okay? So this is part of why I think I said in the very first session, or maybe in the introduction, I pointed out that most now conservative sort of traditional non-affirming theologians and pastors or whatever, they've really stopped using Genesis 19 at all, because I think now the ship has totally sailed. Like, yeah, I think we need to be honest, y'all. This doesn't have anything to say about our LGBTQ brothers, sisters, and siblings. All right? So we got one session left, and it's called Unclobbering Genesis 19. Let's get to it.
Just to keep you on schedule here, we have one more of these short sessions, and we're just going to go right into discussion. Obviously, if you need to stretch, get up and stretch. You need to use the restroom, use the restroom, but just trying to keep things on time. Thanks.
All right, let's bring this whole thing home, shall we? Unclobbering Genesis 19 once and for all. This final session, session 6, I'm simply titling Unclobbering Genesis 19, because the point is that once we've done all this work to explore the context of the book, to explore the context of the culture in which it was written, to listen to the larger biblical witness of what was going on with Sodom and Gomorrah, this clobber passage should not be clobbering anyone ever again. Never should have in the first place, and never should again. So here's what I have to say when all is said and done with this passage. What's the best way to understand this passage? What's the best way to understand what's going on in Genesis 19? Well, I think it's this. I think embodying hospitality is a signpost of the divine. Think about that. Now, what if this story existed because people of Israel were called by their God, Yahweh, to be a light unto the world, to reveal to the world the character of who Yahweh was. And God is a God who honors and welcomes and provides and empowers. So Israel's calling was to embody that same love and hospitality into the world. So you could say that embodying hospitality points to God. It's a signpost of the divine. How we treat other people matters. It matters how we treat others. I would say it especially matters how we treat others who are different from us. How we treat outsiders. How we treat other people matters. And Israel was uniquely called to embody this kind of radical hospitality. So this ancient story, this legend of Sodom and Gomorrah and their destruction, it served as this resounding note, this bass note that kind of carried throughout the history of Israel as this reminder. Don't forget to love the outsider. Don't forget to care for the needy. Don't forget to provide for those who need it. Don't forget to welcome and honor all people. Because how we treat the oppressed, and the outsider, the marginalized, and the outcast, it matters. It matters. Israel was invited to embody a radical hospitality. This was who they were to be in the world, to embody this radical hospitality, like Abraham in Genesis 18, and then like Lot in Genesis 19. And Sodom and Gomorrah was their epic reminder. And then Christians, I believe, are called to the same kind of life and the same kind of love. This is what we're called to be and to do in the world. So finally, Genesis 19, it's not about orientation. This story has nothing to say to those who identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or transgender, or queer. It's just not about orientation, and it's not about people who are in a same-sex relationship. It's not. It's not. It's about how are we using our power and our resources to care for the outsider, to care for those who need it. That's what it's about. That's what it's about. And if it has anything to say about sex, great. You want to know what it says? Don't participate in gang rape. Yeah, I think we can all get down with that. That's really the only part about this that has anything to do with sex. And nobody is advocating that is something that anybody should be doing. So that's it, my friends. That is the conclusion of the clobber passage of Genesis 19. And I hope by now you see what myself and so many others see, which is, all right, that has nothing to do with LGBTQ people. So if we're gonna keep using the Bible to justify discrimination, we got to look elsewhere, because that one has nothing to say about it. And so that elsewhere is places like Leviticus 18 and 20. And so if you haven't yet done that course, I invite you to check that course out. If you've already purchased it or you've got the whole package, then I'll see you there when you get there. And that's it for the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, there's Romans chapter 1, verse 26 and 27, which is pretty popular. So check that course out if you haven't. And then Paul's 2 letters, one to the church in Corinth and one to his friend Timothy. So that's it, friends. We did it. We unclobbered Genesis 19. Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this last hour or so, or however long you took to go through this course. I hope to see you in future courses, or if you want to join me in a live workshop, then that information should be here on the website at unclobbered.com. But I wish you peace, and I wish you wholeness, and I wish you love. Goodbye.
Okay, I think that's a wow moment. What do you think? So we're going to try and get into a discussion. We were, as you see, set up to do a little smaller group, but since we have this awesome participation, we've got Bill with microphone, and if you've got question, concern, comment, we'd love to hear it. Love to just start something going. Just give a hello, wave, whatever.
And if anyone streaming would like to text a question to bring to the group, feel free.
Yes, we can. At home, you can text and we'll get your question and get discussion going.
What'd you think?
As a woman, you can imagine just how that sits about giving the virgin daughters up. But you know, how I think of it is that they may have been, probably were, the most precious possessions, family, that he had, right? And we know the value of virginity back then as well, that you were disgraced if you weren't a virgin. So these were precious, precious children to him. And that just, again, reinforces that point of how important hospitality is. That it is, I will give up the most precious thing I have to protect these people. Kind of reminds me of Jesus, actually. Yeah,
Most definitely. Yeah, the hospitality thing is seriously an eye-opener in how important that is. And to this day, in this parish, how important hospitality is. It's just wonderful to be welcomed, I'll tell you that.
I'm sure it probably struck everybody, but what was just jumping out to me through that whole presentation was many of the same Christians who would be using this to condemn LGBTQ folks are the same folks who would be condemning folks trying to cross the border to come into our country that are seeking hospitality because their lives are threatened, you know. So it's such an upside down view. And yet I think, too, the other thing that would strike me is most Christians, most Catholics anyway, have never had the opportunity to really study the scriptures to see the meaning behind them. So, it's just sort of like education is so important. Ignorance leads to fear, fear leads to hatred, and hatred leads to violence. And so one of the roles of the church is to break that cycle of ignorance.
it just occurred to me that this emphasis on hospitality itself has its roots in what was happening in the communities. And part of the function of hospitality was to create a kind of relationship so that everyone could survive. That if we're hospitable to this tribe, they will be hospitable to us, and all of us together have a better chance at surviving as a whole. So I really think that there was like this larger kind of function to this. It wasn't just hospitality to be nice, it was hospitality to survive.
I just want to mention a different impact this had on me, because I remember vividly growing up and hearing that it's wrong to be gay, just like in Sodom and Gomorrah. I remember hearing that. And I just like that as someone who's trying to learn to raise my voice, that I now can say, no, it's not like Sodom and Gomorrah, and this is why. That's what I really appreciate about this, because I feel like it gives me some words that I can use to maybe educate others. So I appreciate that it put it in a context that I feel like I can replicate in the world.
I'll get you started. I have a, oh, you got somebody back there. I won't interrupt that.
It's like facing classes in school when I used to teach. Nobody wants to talk.
Yeah, I thought it was an excellent study. And the question that it left in my mind is, I wondered why the church and the hierarchy of the church continue to perpetuate a misunderstanding, and why, what does the hierarchy gain from that, and why don't they look at something like this and change their teaching?
Father, can I add to that? Do you mind if I throw my opinion on that one? I'll try to be kind. But I think you saw in the presentation the section on gang rape. And we know that that's just rape in general is about power. And giving up that power has always been a difficult thing for humans. That's my opinion.
I think that's an excellent question, because, as I mentioned at the beginning, this approach to the study of Scripture is endorsed by all the mainline Christian religions, Catholic, Presbyterian, Lutheran. So it's not like something that he's out of this world with this. This is mainline Scripture teaching on this particular part of Scripture. So it's a complicated thing. I really, there are bishops in Africa who support government laws that jail gay people, even kill gay people. And my question is exactly the same. Why doesn't the church take those bishops and put them through a course like this? This isn't an issue of liberal or conservative or traditional, or it's the truth. It's reality. If we don't go, it's like saying the earth is flat if we continue using this passage in the way that it was taken literally in the past. So I think we need to continue to confront our leadership in our Catholic Church and in other churches too. Well, people are going to get upset if you blah, blah. It's nothing to do with right or left or whatever. This is empirical data, from the best scholars in the world at this point. So to me, that's the way out of this mess, But why the church, in some of recent documents from some dioceses and things, they'll go right back to the clobber text, even though their own scholars are saying. And part of it is this crazy thing, we don't want to upset people and whatever. In the meantime, we're the blood is on our hands. To the extent that we continue to use these verses, we are encouraging violence against gay people across the world. And in our own, right across the street, as we know, Rescue Mission is going to open a house for teenagers, 13 to 18, who are homeless on the streets of Syracuse because they've been thrown out of their mainly Christian homes because they identify as gay. Well, where's the church on this? You know, this minister was a wife and kids, very popular pastor, was thrown out of his congregation because he dared to study and find out the truth. You know, it's the same thing as it's like if we take this literally and spin it the way it's been spent, it would be the same thing as saying, well, we don't believe in evolution, that God created the world in 7 days and then had a nice dinner. And I mean, it's the same thing. You know, it's not liberal conservative. It's the truth. You know, what the truth will set us free, as Jesus said. So I think that's the question of the day. And we need to encourage our bishops, and our bishop in this diocese is very, I think, educated in this area. Those of us who met with him on many issues like this, but they're sort of gun shy to be public about it because they're nervous about the feedback. Well, I'd rather be truthfully rejected than keep lies that are hurting people continuing. I think that's the crucial question.
I think there's one important thing that we try to do with all of our educational functions from the task force. But this one, to me, is very important, and you've heard the term, you see something, say something. And that's the power we're trying to give you, is take that power. You hear this misuse, you hear these clobber passages, say something. That slowly but surely makes change.
I would also encourage everyone here that if I would encourage everyone here, if you agree with what's being said here, there are 3 more sessions. Post it on your social media, invite your friends, put it on Instagram, put it on Facebook. All the information's on the All Saints website, because the more people we can inform, that's a ripple effect. And that's what I was, I guess, not gracefully saying, but about learning to raise my voice, is that it's one thing to have an open and affirming parish right here. It's another thing to say it's got to go beyond these walls. And we're the ones who have to do it.
What was not said is the fear, the anxiety of the unknown, and we don't place our faith in God. We place our faith in fear of the other person who is different from us. And then when we become aware of this person is different, we then fear that person. We see that person as our enemy. And that's the perception. So we lose our faith, our relationship with Christ, because we are now overwhelmed and taking other person's prejudices. So we put Christ to the side, and we bring our fear, and maybe Satan is doing it. It's that we lose our faith in Christ because now we've pushed away his word, where he says to love one another, and now we take the words of fear one another.
I want to say on a personal note that's why I think it's so important for members of the LGBTQ community, which I am, to be out so people know you. I spent 30-some years teaching school, and I was in the closet the whole time because I was afraid of losing my job. When I finally spoke who I was, people knew me. They loved me as a person, so it didn't matter. And I think that's part of the issue. It's like Father Fred said, it's fear. Fear of the unknown, and that becomes even worse. But unless you're a member of my community, you have no idea the amount of hurt that the church has caused in us. To sit in the pew and you're trying to be a good Catholic and you get told that you're an evil person that's going to hell because you can't control who you are. And I actually had a confessor tell me that, if you can't stop doing that, don't come back. And so I stayed away from the church for 25 years because of that.
I remember growing up and always feeling like I was different than everybody else in the classroom. And I carried that for a long time and kept it hidden. And then when I got older, I ended up in a 12-step program, and I had to do a 4-step and a 5th-step. And when it came to looking at the sexuality part, it was the hardest thing to come out with, because I was so afraid that if I admit, what's going to happen? So I sat with my sponsor that night, who was a female, told her. She asked me some questions, and when I got all done, she just looked at me. She said, I love you now more than I loved you before you told me, for being so honest. And I looked at her and I said, but the only thing I have a problem with now, I said, I feel like I've lost God. So she put me in touch with a priest down in Philadelphia. They ran the marriage classes for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. And I said to her, you got to be kidding me. I'm going to go sit in front of this priest and tell him I'm gay? She said, please, just trust me. Just go to him, please. So I did. I went for like six sessions with him, talking with him. And when I got done, I came out with like a weight lifted off my shoulders. His words to me were, God doesn't judge you because of who you're with. He judges you based on how you treat the person that you're with. He said, so what his analogy was to me, if you have a husband and a wife, a male and a female, and the male is beating the hell out of the female, what's God going to judge? Well, you were married, you're a man and a woman, fine, you come into heaven. You're two gay people, you go to hell. And that's not the way it is, he told me. He said, God's going to look at what you do and how you treat the people that you're with. Like he's talking about the hospitality and the way that we perceive people and the way we treat them in our everyday life. And he just told me, he said, you go about your life and live it the way you were born. This was a given thing to you by God, and he said, you live it that way. And I was just utterly amazed at how he just totally accepted me. Told me to go home and pack a bag and put the old God out the front door and go to the back window and open it up and let the new God come in. And I thought that was so powerful. And that was coming from another Catholic priest.
I was thinking we ought to build walls around our churches and synagogues to keep those homosexuals out, and we should make Mexico pay for it.
Okay, I'm sure that was in jest, right? Okay, I will wrap it up. I want to, on behalf of the task force, on behalf of the parish, thank each and every one of you for being here this evening. It is I don't know, there's words that I try to formulate because it's very personal to me. Just thank you very much. And a reminder, the parish will facilitate a book order if anyone's interested. There is a sign-up sheet out in the entryway. Please feel free to put your name, give us contact information, and we'll make sure that you get a book one way or another. Again, next Monday, another session, 7 o'clock, and we are going to be very hospitable. Thank you.